Sports are more than just a competition and a trophy. Sports are a portal for everyday people to pursue their wildest dreams on some of the world's largest stages. My name is Riley Sager, and I'll be taking you along with me as I hear from SBC and VSL alumni who pursued a career in the business of sports. In this series, I will sit down with guests to discuss strategies for entering the sports world and what you can do to differentiate yourself in the industry. From playing to coaching to broadcasting, the common denominator for any job in sports is the ability to push oneself to become a master at their craft while connecting with others who share that same passion to be great. Let's get into it. Today, we're excited to feature Simon Cherin-Gordon, an SBC alum and the manager of social content at the NBA. With a BFA in Fine Arts and Photography from Sonoma State University, Simon brings a unique artistic vision to the world of digital sports media. His journey from SBC to the NBA highlights his deep expertise in content strategy and fan engagement across platforms. We can't wait to dive into Simon's career insights, his passion for storytelling, and his advice to aspiring professionals in this dynamic industry. Tune in for an inspiring episode. Simon, welcome to SBC Audio Experience. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I can't wait to hear about your time with SBC and now with your professional career.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. I love staying connected to the program. It's been a couple of years since I was able to speak there, but obviously having been a student, worked for the program and coming back and speaking, it's something I'm always excited to be part of.
Now you're currently the manager for social content at NBA, but your experience started before then. You were at Sonoma State University, and then you also did the SBC program. So can you talk a little bit about what made you get involved in social content and what you learned from Sonoma State?
Yeah, for sure. So, just backing up more than that, I always wanted to work in sports media. Like, my goal growing up was to be a sports writer. Even going back to when I was probably 10, 11 years old, I would just write in notebooks about sports. Started a blog, middle school, covering my high school sports teams. College, I did a bunch of freelance writing for various websites. So that was always a goal of mine, but I also spent my time in college studying art, photography specifically, which I know we might get into more, but just having said that, I was kind of trying to pick a lane, which direction I'm going to go in. And it was also just really difficult finding jobs in sports media, particularly as a writer. So I went to SBC kind of with the goal of figuring out more specifically what lane I want to get into. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that too. But that's how I ended up in social media, really. So it was a journey from a young age to where I ended up.
What was your college experience like? Did you know, obviously you just said you wanted to pick a lane and that's what SBC was for, but did you go in with the mindset of, okay, yes, I'm studying fine arts and photography, but this can also apply to sports?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I like I said, I knew I wanted to do sports writing, but I also knew I wanted to spend my time in college studying art. I went to Sonoma State because my cousin had gone there. She was an art student. I loved the campus. I wasn't really too focused at that point in terms of I need to find the perfect program or the perfect major. It's just I have interests and I want to enjoy my 4 years in college, which ended up being 6 years because I did a year abroad. And then I also did a BFA program to get my Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. So it was a long period of time. But I really kind of just did both. And like I said, I didn't know specifically how it was going to play out. It was my last year or two of college, really, especially my last year. I was really trying to I have to make a decision. Doesn't have to be for the rest of my life, but it has to be a decision. It was do I go the sports media route, which I was working towards with freelance writing. I had written for Bleacher Report, fan-sided some different websites. This was back when Bleacher Report was not owned by Turner. So, now it's like the biggest names in sports writing right there, but that's not what it was back then. But it was really like trying to pick a lane. And I decided I'm going to go the sports writing route. And then I was giving myself like, I don't know if it was 5 years or if it was until I was 30. The difference wasn't that big because I didn't graduate college until I was 24. But I basically gave myself a window of time to try and like make it in sports media, which I knew was no guarantee super competitive. And I was like, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to go to grad school, get my MFA, and do something more in the art world. And what I ended up kind of realizing, again, through going to SBC, meeting a lot of people in the industry, was that my fine arts background, particularly like the photo and video side of it, tied in with my writing experience in the social space in like a pretty perfect way.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we know, there are a lot of different majors, opportunities, lectures, guest speakers in this immersive experience. So what, I guess, key moments stood out to you and you're like, okay, this is going to help me decide ultimately what you want to do with your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were a few key moments. One, I would just say was like, just to shout out like a couple of the people who like really helped me throughout that program was, Dave Dufour, first and foremost, was someone who I just talked to a bunch about like the media world. He, was wanted to get into coaching, scouting, before he was a student at SBC, and then he went more into the media space. So he was like a great person to talk to just about like having an open mind and not like, you don't have to go into that program and be like, I want to be this or that. And like he was a great example of how that can really benefit you to have that kind of flexibility. I talked to a lot of podcasters and writers because that's what I went in thinking about. Nate Duncan, Eric Pincus, people like that were super helpful. But the people that really like shaped like what I would say was like my aha moment during that 1 week program were Tracy Weisenberg, who ran the broadcast section of SBC at the time. She was, doing social for Summer League. She has done a lot of stuff with Turner over the years. Now I believe she's doing digital strategy for Octagon Sports, but she basically just could see what I couldn't see, which was how good of a fit in social I would be based on like my skill set. So she put me in touch with some team social people. It was Charlie Widows, who was with the Sixers at the time, since he's been with the Clippers. Now he's here in New York with the Nets. It was Nick Monroe, who runs social for the Bucks. And it was Jason Wise, who runs digital for the Kings. And like all of these people basically said the same thing to me, which was that when we're looking for social media, when we're looking to hire people on our team, the skill set that we look for, it's not being like an influencer. It's not understanding like trends and things like that. It's literally like writing ability and like multimedia ability, video editing, like a lot of the skills that I had. So that reshaped how I viewed social media. And I feel like the combination of having that direction and then also having those connections and mentors to ask questions to gave me like so much more so much more clarity coming out of that week than I had going into it.
Yeah, you mentioned your perspective on social media had changed. The program's only a week long, but everyone I've talked to, so much happens, so much can change in that 1 week, whether you're learning a new skill, networking, that kind of thing. So what was your headspace leaving the program, going into the real world, trying to get a job? What had changed since before the program, and where'd you go from there?
Yeah, so for me, it was pretty stark. I mean, I had spent like a lot of time. I was a student at SBC a year after I graduated college. So I spent my first year out of college working for a sports media startup, and continuing to do freelance writing and stuff like that. I left the program with a lot more kind of focus on the types of things I was looking for. It still took about another year before I found full-time work in social, in the basketball world, but I just felt like I was like I had a foot in the door, and like the process felt like it was going to lead to something from that place. And it was about 6 months after that I started working for SBC, like running their social media. So then the next summer I was there, managing social at the program, getting to know these mentors even better. And I left that summer with even more momentum, but it really was like a build from that summer as a student.
When did you start working with NBA? Was it 2019?
Yeah, so I started September 2019 at the NBA. It was a couple months after my second summer with SBC, which was like as an intern running their social media. A couple months from there, I really just started like poking around at every, NBA, like ESPN, Bleacher Report, all the big like media companies, the league itself, obviously being the biggest. And it was funny because I wasn't really sure, like the NBA felt like a stretch to me, just based on my experience. But what I ended up realizing when I like was interviewing a lot of places, like I didn't hear back from, the NBA was, of the places like that on that level, was the only place that I even like interviewed at. And what I realized in retrospect was like, yeah, it might be the league. It's like the biggest company in basketball. It is like basketball essentially. But my experience and like my authentic like love for basketball, covering the game, and my social media skills like just made me a strong fit. So that was a takeaway, that it's like, just because something feels like a reach based on the brand name, like if you're a fit for the role, the company, whoever you're interviewing with, will probably realize that. Whereas for me, I went into that just thinking like, I'm not going to get a job somewhere like that this soon. I didn't feel like my resume was up to that caliber necessarily, but my skill set and the fit and all of that were things that I was undervaluing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously your skill set, it made you qualified for the job. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten it, but you led with the passion, the love for the game. So when you got into that role, what did that look like for you? What were they having you do? How are you utilizing your skills? What did that initial transition to actually working for the NBA look like?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I didn't know exactly what I would be doing when I got hired. It pretty quickly became apparent I'd be working primarily on Twitter, what was known as Twitter back then. So I like initially published to every platform, some Facebook publishing, YouTube publishing. Our team was so much smaller back then. We had about 9 or 10 people. And now the social team is upwards of 30, but we kind of all did everything. But pretty quickly, like I started working primarily and then exclusively on Twitter. And that was, in retrospect, like the fit that made the most sense, just because of all of the platforms. Like Twitter's the most connected to like covering stats, storylines, pure highlights, right? Like it's just the most like basketball heavy, for the most like dedicated fans of the game. It made a lot of sense, but once I started doing that, that was kind of all I was doing, with live tweeting games 5 nights a week.
Like you said, Twitter, X, it's 24/7. If some piece of news is breaking, somebody has to report it. Was that a hard transition for you, or what was the greatest adjustment, I guess, working for this enormous company where you kind of have to be ready all the time?
Yeah, I think it was, in a couple ways, it was really natural. I mean, I had spent, I lived on the East Coast. My first year out of college, I moved to New York. I moved to LA actually a year later and was out in LA for that year between essentially between being an SBC student, like I talked about, and then starting at the NBA. But I moved back to New York after that. And just being on the East Coast the previous year, I had adjusted to the hours. I was working at the sports media startup that I had mentioned, but then I was still freelance writing and covering NBA games every night. And the way I had to do that was I would get home from work, it'd be 7 p.m. I'd watch games until 1 a.m. and then I'd write until 3 or 4 a.m. And I've always been a night owl, so that wasn't that hard for me. And then that experience, I think, prepared me even better for what my job became, which was 5 nights a week, working till 2, 3 a.m. This was also pre-COVID, so the whole operation was done in person out of the league office in Secaucus, New Jersey. So I would be in the office till, like I said, 2, 3 a.m. and then heading back to Brooklyn at 4 a.m., getting home around then and going to bed at 5 and just living on this nocturnal schedule. It was easy relatively because I had always been more like that, but at the same time it was I had to sacrifice my social life for a long time. I had to get used to some of it was nice because you can do certain things during the day that you can't do if you work a 9 to 5, right? I was able to go grocery shopping, I was able to go to the laundromat, things like that would be harder if I was working during the day. So I found the advantages, but obviously that's a huge adjustment still in figuring out how to still have a life and stay on top of it and not just be totally thrown off in whatever way possible. I think in terms of the basketball coverage itself, obviously it's going to be a huge transition. I had never done anything like that. No one has ever done anything like that, basically, because it's such a unique thing. I mean, even people that work for Team Social haven't done something so similar, because you're covering all 30 teams when you work at the NBA. So it's just the breadth of what you're doing is totally unique. And that was an adjustment period, but at the same time, there's training, you're brought along slowly. There's stress and, it's exhilarating in good and bad ways. So that was an adjustment, but it was a fairly natural fit, I would say, from a lifestyle perspective.
Personally, I can't imagine being on that schedule. Writing till 3 a.m. and then being up till 5. But no, you're right, it is different. You're not just covering one team, you're not just covering one roster of players. You have the entire league. So how do you balance, you said 5 games a week, but how do you balance covering that many players, that much content?
You have to always prioritize in your brain. So you have to have almost I think the biggest part of the training, I mean, there's you have to learn the brand voice, which is its own thing, right? You have to write the NBA writes. You have to be accurate, you have to be fast, you have to build up the muscle memory of a process with multiple tabs open, and I'm uploading this video to post while I'm writing copy for this other post, and you have to learn all of that. But I also think that you have to also develop a sense, and this might be the hardest part and the part that takes the longest, and I'm still learning, and the team that I manage now, we're talking through all the time, is how do you decide between, in terms of priorities, LeBron James is up to 19 points in the first half in a game that's on NBA League Pass versus, Scoot Henderson has 15 points in the first quarter in a game that's on ESPN. You have to be kind of weighing who the player is, what the storyline is it a priority game, and what do I do first? And then have this sense in your brain of okay, I have to focus here. I'm going to start working on this post, but then if something else happens that's a higher priority moment, a game winner is hit, or there's the dunk of the year, I have to like drop what I'm doing, post that, and then come back to this. So like that type of prioritization is what really keeps you above water. And then once you have that, it's, yeah, I might be doing a lot. I might be covering a ton, like you said, 30 teams that, you know, not most nights, not all 30 teams are playing, but 25 of them might be, or not, it would never be 25, 24. But like, once you kind of know how to prioritize, you can actually not feel as overwhelmed by the volume, because at the end of the day, you are just one person. And as long as you're moving as fast as you can in a reasonable manner, things are just you're just going to go through your checklist. Okay, I did this. This is next. And eventually you'll catch up.
I like what you said about having to adjust to the brand, you know, the mission. Like, you're not writing on your own personal Twitter account. You're doing it on behalf of the league. So how, you know, what does that look like? How do you adapt to being part of the NBA and speaking on behalf of the league instead of just maybe what your initial instinctive thoughts are, or, you know, what you want to post? How do you become a part of that?
Yeah, there's really two sides of that. One is like learning the brand voice, and then is learning like what the brand values. So the voice is just like the number one thing I did even before I interviewed was just looking at the NBA's Twitter feed and like reading how they write tweets, and then trying to understand like what's happening here. I was coming from a journalism world where you're not as concise, and I was able to look at these posts and be like, okay, they're actually conveying a lot of information in a very concise way. So I kind of had that understanding of like, you know, if let's say you were writing what happened, you might say like Steph Curry hit his 5th 3-pointer of the night to reach 40 points for the game, giving the Warriors a 12-point lead heading into halftime on TNT. You could convey all of that in a tweet. You could just say like, Steph splash, like he's got 40, Warriors lead by 12, TV emoji, TNT, like halftime on TNT. Like you could cut the words, you know, like you could have 10 times less words and convey all of that information. So it's like learning how to convey a lot of information, and then learning, you know, the minutia of the do's and don'ts, you know, what type of language do we use, you know, whatever. But the other part of it too is just like understanding how to speak to the content as the league. Like, what's the league? We represent the players. So you have to make sure that you're being positive. You have to make sure that you're being celebratory. You know, I don't think it's like a surprise to anyone, but a media company like ESPN can post a lot of things that the NBA can't and doesn't want to, because it's negative and it puts players in a bad light. And like that, I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, it's unfortunate that gets engagement. Like, I understand why it does. Like, people want controversial stories, and it makes sense, but that's obviously like not our place as the league. And so that's kind of the other adjustment, where when you're like working as a journalist, you're always looking for an angle, maybe a critical angle, maybe it's not even engagement driving, it's just trying to find your own kind of lane of analysis. But one thing you realize when you're working for the league is the story of this game is that it's LeBron versus Steph. And like, when you're a writer, you might not even think of that as the story of the game, because you see it everywhere. Like, yeah, it's LeBron and Steph is on every graphic you see and on every commercial you see, and you're trying to find a deeper cut. But you have to shift that mentality when you start working for the league and realize like, oh, we're the ones that are making those graphics and like putting out those storylines that are the main things that get people to watch the games.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of your strategies for storytelling? You know, it's Twitter, so like you said earlier, it's concise, it's straight to the cut, but you have a job as a journalist. to deliver the information, but you also have a responsibility on behalf of the league. So what are your strategies, and what do you think resonates with fans?
Yeah, I mean, like, we obviously want to cover the league as from both the standpoint of here's what's happening and here's what resonates, right? Like, we are never gonna go away from like celebrating players and teams that are performing well just because they don't have as big of a following. Part of your job as the NBA is to build up that following, and like educate people is a huge part of it too, right? If there's a great player that doesn't get as many, video views as like another player, even if they're a better player, we would never shy away from covering that player because they get less engagement. It's our job to A, celebrate that player from a journalistic standpoint, but B, educate people on, oh, this guy is amazing and here's why, and hopefully encourage people to like start caring more about, watching their games or just, appreciating their season or whatever it might be. So I think that's the other part of the storytelling aspect that like I think is really cool, at getting to work for the league and kind of being like a part of teaching people about basketball, whether again like the example I just gave, or whether it's a certain type of play that might not get as much love on social media. Like, it's not a big dunk, it might be a really good screen or like a great defensive rotation. It's getting to see something like that as a basketball fan and then put it into content that like people are going to see and hopefully learn from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fan base, of course, has always been there for the NBA. The love for the game has always been there. But on your past couple years working with the NBA and social media, what changes have you seen? And where do you think this is going? You said, you started right outside of college after you graduated from Sonoma State and SBC and then NBA. So, a couple years now, what do you think those major changes are?
It's hard to say. There's always, emerging platforms. Platforms are changing all the time. It's really hard to say. I mean, obviously, like, one big change since I started at the NBA was the NBA launched a next generation app, which I'm involved in as well. And it's just understanding like the appetite for basketball content is like more and more mobile based and more based on push notifications, based on things kind of being delivered to you directly rather than you having to like know when to tune into games and being at home or knowing where you're going to be for that 3-hour block. So that's nothing new, but I think we're just moving more and more in that direction. And I think, you see it with other leagues too, developing their own apps and developing like revamping their products like NBA League Pass or, NFL Red Zone or whatever it might be. I think it's customizing content more to the consumer. And that's really like, I don't know if that takes place on social media. I don't know if it takes place on apps. I don't know if 5 years from now we're going to have a totally different landscape with all that stuff. But I think that's the direction the industry is heading.
Why? What do what's that one factor? Maybe it's technology and just you can do more things with social media, whether that's AI, whether that's just people figuring out how they can utilize it in their jobs and their daily life. What do you think is that underlying factor that's kind of pushing not just the NBA but other leagues towards
I think it's just like all entertainment. It's not just sports. I mean, it's like once you have the option to stream a TV show like as you wish, ad free if you have a subscription to Netflix or HBO Max or whatever it is, it's hard to then go back to watching like, oh, this show's on at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'm going to like make sure to be home. It's like, well, I am going to make a plan then, and then I'll watch that show later. And I think it's similar with sports. I think like people just we as a society like are busier than we've ever been. Like everyone is just getting busier and busier, and we want to consume more and more. And I don't know if that's a good thing. It's not like in my ideal world, we would like slow down and take a step back, but obviously we're not heading in that direction. So I think it's just the demand of society is we are doing too much and like balancing too many priorities, that if you're offering something to me that I have to be rigid about my consumption of, I'm just not going to do it. And like, that's the demand of like people, and sports leagues obviously have to adjust to what people want.
Yeah, and social media can be very oversaturated. It seems like everybody's trying to give their opinion, whether it's journalists, whether it's people who have no background, who just like sports and want to record on it. So your role now as manager of social content at NBA, are you working with a team, and what are you telling them on how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with a big team. I manage a team of a few different publishers that all publish to X, and then every platform at the NBA has their version of me. We have our YouTube lead, we have our Meta platforms lead, we have our TikTok and Snapchat lead, and then we all have teams, and then there's manager of our team, and then we work with other departments, the app, content creation that delivers all of our video assets. And it's a huge operation. We're always having conversations about strategy, both upwards with leadership, and then also with our teams, giving direction and hearing about the night to night. I do a lot less night publishing than I used to. I'm more oversee. I, work during the day. I have meetings and I oversee our publishing and kind of train our team on that. But I'm always listening to like the people that I manage about like what they're seeing, because they're more in the day to day than I am. And I think that's like important anywhere, is just like for whoever is like making decisions somewhere to not go just off of, oh, this is what worked when I was doing that, or this is what I think works. It's like, listen to the people that are more and more plugged in. Also, like, I just turned 32. So like, I understand that before long, if not already, like there are going to be a lot of things about like social media discourse that I might not understand as well as like someone who I just hired that's like 25. So like listening to that, I think, is super important.
What steps are you and your team doing now to grow the brand? Obviously, the league is very international. So how are you trying to get that new fan base?
I think it's as simple as like what I was saying earlier, just about like covering all players, and like players that might not have as big of a following. Like obviously Nikola Jokic doesn't have as big of a following as LeBron James, but like Jokic has won 3 of the last 4 MVPs. So it's like making sure that we're doing everything we can to let people know how great he is and show why he's so great. So that's one aspect of it. I'd say the other aspect, it might not be as like international focused, but there's like high school basketball and players coming into the league. The NBA launched Future Starts Now platforms last year, which we have an X account, we have an Instagram account. We're, basically on every handle we have a Future Starts Now vertical, and it's essentially like looking at, youth sports, high school tournaments, things like that, and focusing on like that next generation of stars, making sure that people know about them long before like they're rookies in the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, the NBA, you said this earlier, with the 5 games a week, that's what you were doing, but then you have the season. The season's not all year long, but the NBA is. You have the combine, the draft. How do you keep that momentum from the season, postseason, finals? How do you keep that going all year round, constantly trying to get new followers and new fans when there aren't games going on?
Yeah, when I started, the off season was a lot more difficult. We had to really obviously, like you mentioned, there's draft, all stars is a huge, opportunity for us every year. and then there's summer league. But it used to be like outside of that, we would really have to get creative during the off season, and figure out ways to repackage content and get people to stay engaged. I think it's gotten so much easier just with what, like I said, the coverage of whether it's like high school sports, whether it's pro-ams in this off season, whether it's international like Olympics, or FIBA. There's just always kind of basketball related things happening. And it's become a lot less of a challenge to stay busy 12 months a year.
Yeah. There's always something to do.
Yeah, exactly.
What's your advice to people who either want to start working in social media, they want to have their own platforms, cover sports, content creators? We just mentioned there's always content 24/7. So what's your advice to them for building a solid portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, obviously if someone has a clear vision for like what they want to do and what differentiates them and why their content is great, and if they have the like self management skills, the time management, the ability to like be their own boss and like do a million different things at once, right? Create content, run different social media channels, manage community engagement on those channels, do everything they need to do in order to edit video, be the talent on the video they're editing, like everything that they need to do in order to build up their audience and be like an independent content creator. Like that's incredible. And like, I could never do that, but there are people that do and can be successful with it. And I would never discourage anyone from like being confident in their vision for building out a platform like that. But what I would say is I just don't think people have to go that route. And I think that like a lot of people might feel like, oh, they want to work in this space, they have to do it as like a content creator and they have to like build up a following. And like, to be honest, like I don't really know how to build up a following for myself. Like I've never had a big following on Twitter or on any social platform. Like that's not my wheelhouse. And that's, like I said, kind of at the beginning of our convo, why I initially thought social was a bad fit for me was because I didn't understand like how you grow your following on like an organic level. But like what I was good at was writing. I knew a lot about basketball. I knew how to communicate about basketball. I knew how to edit video and all that. So for me, it wasn't like building up a following that got me a job at the NBA, because also like the NBA doesn't really need you to have that skill set. Like the NBA has its product, which everybody wants basketball content. So point being, the alternate route to like building up a personal following is going and working for a company, a media, whether it's a league, a media company, a team, a platform that has a built-in fan base and a built-in following that you can engage in other ways. Like I think that is a super powerful way to build up your portfolio. And even if you do down the line want to go the independent route, you're going to learn so much about content from like working within a structure, like, and learning so much like best practices and all that. Like I just think that that's for 9 out of 10 people, if not 99 out of 100 people, like makes more sense as a path and is not a path that most people consider. But they're like, that's just how the industry looks. It's like there's so many more jobs working for a company than there are spaces for like people, individuals.
Yeah, that's a great point, because maybe not just the NBA, but other leagues, they want to see what skills you have. So while building your own brand can help develop those skills, that's, they ultimately want to see what can you do for my brand. So that's great advice. And now we're just 1 month into the season. What are your goals for this season? Building the brand, building the NBA. What are you working on right now?
Yeah, I think, one exciting thing that started last year was the NBA Cup. This is the second season of the NBA Cup, so that's obviously a huge focus. And it's cool to cover that. I feel like a lot of what we do, I mean, I love covering everything we cover, but I think that sometimes we're covering things that have just been established, and it's more like we're telling a story that we had to learn of something that exists. Whereas with the NBA Cup, it's like we're more defining it ourselves, and like we're figuring out like, how do you communicate these things that have never been communicated? I don't work directly on our graphics team, but our graphics team gets to create a brand identity for something that like doesn't have a brand identity yet with the NBA Cup. And I work closely with them. Right. And we do the same thing for like social copy. So it's a really exciting and you know, the courts are another thing, right? We get to unveil these new courts every year, and figure out how to best like show fans the new designs. So it's cool to be part of things like that are like new and exciting, and that you can kind of define yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of working with, even if it is a giant brand like the NBA and you're just one person among hundreds and thousands of people, you get to be a part of that. It's something new, and there's always things that are being added to the league. The NBA Cup, for example, like you're talking about. So I think it's cool that you get to be a part of it.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And I mean, it's like, that's overall, I would say, like, probably the coolest thing about my job to me is just these things that I care about naturally. Like, I get to be a part of communicating them to people, and like, I don't really have to ever force it, because it's, yeah, like, I loved watching that crazy finish of that game. And then I like tweeted about it, and people saw that. You know what I mean? It's a very natural flow when it's something you just naturally care about so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Simon, thank you for coming on SBC Audio Experience. I appreciate all the tips, advice, and insight into your career and how you got started. So thank you.
Thanks, Riley. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in to our VSL Talent Alumni Series with SBC alum Simon Cherin-Gordon. I hope you enjoyed hearing about his introduction to the sports world and learned something new about what it takes to jumpstart your career in the sports industry. Please like us on social media, subscribe, and leave a review. You can find the show notes at sportsbusinessclassroom.com. Let us know if you listen, and if you enjoyed this episode, tag us on your Instagram story at Sports Business Classroom. Text it to a friend and spread the news of this year's SBC Business of Basketball Immersive Experience. This episode is also brought to you by Hall Pass Media, a full-service marketing agency that specializes in brand consulting, event management, digital marketing, and creative design. For more information on Hall Pass Media, go to hallpassnetwork.com.